Welcome back to Chinese 270 China and the West, the online version. Where had we left off last class? We had, of course, talked about this beautiful map by Matteo Ricci, and I had asked you to roam the map via this interactive this interactive map, right? And I had wanted you to write a response. So I haven't read them yet. They haven't been posted yet, and I really look forward to your explorations. I hope you'll enjoy that. I had told you that I wanted to focus just a little bit on a couple of colophones, text written on that map that I thought were really interesting. And of course, maybe one of the most interesting is the one about Europe, where Matteo Ricci was from. So let's have a quick look. He says, Europe. The continent of Europe comprises more than 30 countries, all of which are monarchies that follow the system of the previous kings. No one here indulges in superstitions. Everyone adheres only to the holy religion of the Lord of Heaven, the supreme deity. Every sentence here is so fascinating. So, the first part about 30 countries, right? That's fair enough. All are monarchies, and they follow the system of the previous kings. What does he mean by that? I told you that in China, and we sort of touched upon that a little bit, I think when we read Liezhi's account of Matteo Ricci, that there is a veneration of these ancient kings, the Yao and Shun and the dukes of the Zhou Dynasty, going back 2,000-3,000 years. And Confucius already venerated them, and they were already kings of the antiquity of Confucius times. So this idea of looking at an ancient civilization, a better previous ancient civilizations for guidance, was something that that the Chinese had really internalized. And Matteo Ricci is saying, look, the Europeans are doing the same thing. We're following the system of the previous kings, which in a way really makes some sense if we think about it in the context of the Renaissance, because we said the Renaissance was sort of looking at antiquity. But what he really is doing is he's telling his Chinese audience that, Europe is not that different from China at all. Very important, no one here indulges in superstitions, right? Matteo Ricci was very critical of superstition. He kind of called Buddhism essentially superstition. And again, he wants to show his Chinese audience that Europe doesn't have any of those, what he perceives of negative factors. And then, of course, he says everybody adheres to holy religion of the Lord of Heaven, the supreme deity, right? He kind of tells them, they're all like us, they're all Catholics, so he doesn't mention the Protestants, right? He doesn't mention that new big rift in Europe that's shaking Europe round about the time that Matteo Ricci is over there, right? He doesn't mention any of that. And then he says the officials are divided into three classes. The highest are occupied with matters of religion, then those deciding secular affairs, and finally those who are concerned exclusively with the military. Does that sound familiar to you? Right? We talked about the fact, and we read these reports that Matteo Ricci had sent back to Europe about officials in China, and how there are those, right, the literati, the mandarins, in terms of, essentially of secular affairs, and below them are those in charge of the military, right, that distinction. So again, he's using a language that would have been very familiar to his Chinese audience. The region produces 5 grains, 5 metals, and 100 species of fruit. So again, this idea of 5 grains, 5 metals, this is, if you looked at the Chinese, this is Chinese terminology and the way of dividing categories. Wine is made from the juice of grapes. All of the workers are excellent. They study astronomy and philosophy. Their customs are simple and straightforward. So again, very interesting. First, he makes a point that we Europeans excel at astronomy and philosophy, and we're all excellent, right? He paints this extremely positive image of Europe. And then he says, our customs are simple and straightforward. Does that sound familiar? Well, that's one of the key tenets of Confucianism, right? Self-depreciation, simplicity, straightforwardness. So again, he uses a language that would have been very familiar to the Chinese. They value the 5 relationships. Whoa! The 5 relationships? Do you remember that? We talked about that in the last lecture, those 5 key relationships in Confucianism. Relationship between father and son, ruler and subject, husband and wife, brother and brother, friend and friend, right? Now, again, it's not entirely true. He makes he makes Europeans sound as if they're basically Confucianists, right? Production is very abundant. The princes and the people are powerful and rich. In every season, relations are maintained with foreign countries. The traders and merchants go to every country in the world. It is 80,000 li from the Middle Kingdom. In antiquity, there was no contact with Europe. It is only in the past 70 years that there has been contact, right? So, in a nutshell, Ricci uses distinctly Chinese concepts to explain Europe to his Chinese audience of this map. And he portrays Europe as highly civilized and wealthy and equal to China. Unlike, of course, some of the other places on the fringes of the map. Actually, let me show South America first. What does he say about them? He says, the name Brazil means sapin wood. The inhabitants of this country do not build houses, but dig holes in the earth to make caves to live in. They like to eat human flesh, but they only eat men, not women. They make clothes with feathers of birds. Now, did Matteo Ricci, really believe this? I don't know, maybe he did. Of course, he hadn't been to South America. But at the same time, he clearly wanted to demarcate Europe from other places in the world that were far less civilized, right? He had this idea that by portraying Europe and China as equals and essentially as the pinnacle of civilization, he could appeal to the Chinese. Now, what does he have to say about the Tartars? Do you guys remember who the Tartars were? Who talked a lot about the Tartars? Yeah, Marco Polo talked a lot about the Tartars, right? Those were essentially the Mongols, right? Those, nomadic tribes north of China that threatened China frequently. And he says, the Tartars control a vast territory stretching from the Eastern Sea to the Western Sea. Its people are of the same stock, without much differentiation between them. They are skilled in deception and choose the livelihood of a thief. They have no cities and no fixed homes. They carry the houses on carts so they can be moved quickly, right? So, very different from what Marco Polo had to say about the Mongols, right? He wrote about them, with great admiration. But again, Matteo Ricci has no interest in portraying, essentially what he knows are enemies of the Chinese in a positive light, right? Very interesting, very interesting. Now, there are a lot of other interesting things on this map, and I really hope that you will explore and come up, and find some interesting places and make some interesting observations. Let's see what some Chinese people who saw the map when it was first made in 1602, 3, 4, right? They kept printing it. So this is from a 1603 edition, and a follower, maybe a follower of the Jesuit, Matteo Ricci's, Li Shi wrote, despite the fact that Westerners have sounds in their language and a writing system so different from that of China, we can find commonalities. When the mind is the same, the way of reasoning is also the same. This is why wise men, princes, ministers, and great mandarins are every day closely in contact with them, the Jesuits, right? And reverence them in an extraordinary manner. Now, the Westerners I speak of are Mr. Ricci and 2 or 3 of his fellow members of the Society of Jesus, right? The Jesuits. Now, this is really interesting how he says here, they're different from us, but we can find commonalities, right? What commonalities? Well, it's exactly those commonalities I just said Matteo Ricci quite deliberately put essentially into that colophon on Europe, right? We revere the 5 relationships. We have 5 grains and 5 woods and 5 metals. And our administration is, organized quite similar to the way it is organized in China. And we are really, we excel at these arts and sciences, just like the Chinese, right? So this idea of creating a sense of commonality. And of course, all of this was part of his project of accommodation. So here we have another follower of Matteo Ricci, wrote about the possibility of cross-culture, in response to seeing this map. Just as Western countries have certainly never heard the teaching of the sages of China, so we have never heard of the books of their ancient sages. But now both enlighten each other, both benefit one another. In this way, the whole world has become a single family, and hearts have interpenetrated, so there is no longer a difference between those spreading to the east and those extending to the west. Isn't this beautiful? Isn't this really a beautiful example of how essentially cross-cultural relations can flourish if there is if you want, a genuine attempt at understanding each other and appreciating each other's strong points. Of course, as we said, this was, done quite deliberately by Matteo Ricci by presenting this map in a way, that is a little tainted. And that, of course, is, some of the wording is very deliberate. But, of course, if you want, the ultimate effect of this very positive cross-cultural exchange is really quite stunning, don't you think? Okay, let's move on. Now, I've put a reading on iLearn for you. Actually, you should do it this week. It's called Painted in Oil, Composed in Ink. It's a long chapter. We'll be working with this chapter for some time. And for now, you only have to read pages, I think it's 9 to 16. I indicated that on iLearn. And it's about ekphrasis, or ekphrestic poetry. Whoa, here we have another big word. Maybe somebody wants to look it up in the Oxford English Dictionary. What does it mean? Oh, and by the way, so I gave a talk a while ago at the San Francisco Public Library on this topic, and I gave it in English and in Chinese, and I made a PowerPoint that was in English and in Chinese. So our fellow students from China, you're in luck today. Everything is bilingual on the PowerPoint. Just today, and maybe a couple more times when we will be drawing on this article. So, ekphrestic poetry is essentially poetry about paintings. And this is a very, 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 very old tradition in China. It also exists in the West, by the way, but in China, it's a really, really important genre. If you've seen Chinese paintings, you probably, you might have noticed that there's often writing on them, and often that is a poem that complements the image. Now, there's different kinds of ekphrestic poems. There are those that are written on the painting, really in direct response to the painting, and the two kind of then form, a union. They become part of one artwork. And then there are poems that are just about paintings. So you don't necessarily know what the painting is. You just have a poem written after seeing a painting. And that's the kind of poems we want to focus on today. Now, and those poems, as you will see, deal with Western paintings, or at least paintings that kind of don't look entirely Chinese anymore. Now, a couple of words about Western painting. Now, Western painting is quite strikingly different from, traditional Chinese painting, right? I'm sure you've seen, we've looked at some Chinese painting already. We looked at that painting of the Chinese Song Dynasty city, right? Now this here on the right is quite clearly not a Chinese painting. It's a European painting, right? It strikes us as a European painting. This is actually of the Baroque period. Very famous Italian painter Guido Reni. Now, during the late Ming Dynasty, right, when Matteo Ricci was in China and a little later, and during the early Qing Dynasty, which is the next dynasty, 1644 to 1912, the Jesuits introduced Chinese elites also to painting, to Baroque techniques of painting. Very important. Perspective, right? The idea that when you stand close to something, it's big, and when you look into the distance, it gets smaller, okay? That was something that became very prominent in European painting of the 16th century. Before that, we looked at some of those images from the time of Marco Polo, right? And there was no perspective either. You looked at it, it was sort of very two-dimensional, everything was the same size, often completely out of proportions. So we have perspective. We have chiaroscuro, which means distinction between light and dark, again, to create certain effects, create effects of distance, create effects of shade. The idea of infusing paintings with a high degree of realism, of really making them look like, well, reality. And the use of oil paints. Yeah. Now, oil paints were not really used in China. It was ink, it was watercolors, pigments, but it wasn't oil. So oil painting, right, these big oil paintings, that was really a European thing. Now, the Jesuits, in a way, brought all of this with them to China, right? There was a lot of devotional art, religious art, little paintings of Jesus. There were illustrated books. There were engravings. There was decoration in churches that they built. So they did introduce, again, mostly Chinese elites, to this very different, very alien art. Now, how did Chinese people in the 16th, 17th century feel about this completely different art? I have some quotes here for you. So here's one from a scholar called Gu Qiyuan. He says, figures and buildings are exquisitely executed in lines as fine as thread of human hair. The concavities and convexities of the face are visually no different from a living person. Right? So he observes this extreme realism, essentially, that he compares really to likeness of a human being. Now, even though there was some admiration, it has to be remembered, this is kind of important, the impact on aesthetic conventions, though, Chinese aesthetic conventions, was rather small, was minimal. And then, later on, we'll be talking about that in a couple of weeks. During the Qing Dynasty, there was a lot of suspicion of the West, actually. And it became, at some point even dangerous to be kind of favorably inclined toward, Western things. And that was sort of, you can say, politically motivated. However, and again, this is very interesting. So regardless of political considerations or the political climate at the Qing court, the later court, Chinese painters remained rather indifferent toward Western techniques of painting, and that was really a conscious preference. That was a choice. Yeah. Now, in the Song Dynasty, so this is way back, right? This is before the Mongols. This is kind of around or shortly before the time of Marco Polo. Yeah, Chinese painters no longer emphasized the formal consideration of composition. They were no longer interested in realism, but rather the accumulation of experiences before the beauty of nature, meaning they were no longer interested in depicting nature or reality in a real way. They didn't want to produce paintings that were essentially just copies of reality. But what painters were more interested in is this question: if you see nature, if you see something beautiful, What do we feel? What does it invoke in us? And how can we translate these feelings into painting, right? So the difference then between European painting and Chinese painting is not just one about, mastery of techniques. It's also one, and this is really big, of conscious artistic and aesthetic preferences. So painting then in China, and here we have a nice example, 12th or 13th century painting, Landscape After the Rain, which kind of epitomizes what I was just saying. This is not necessarily a landscape that really exists. It's the landscape that exists in somebody's mind. It creates really more an atmosphere, an emotion, right? So painting in China served to express the thoughts and feelings of an individual. Yeah? And Chinese painters often really considered the painstaking realism of the Jesuits, of European Baroque painting, as inferior. So let's have a couple more quotes from Chinese mandarins at the time. So here's one, Wu Li. He says, "Our painting does not seek physical likeness and does not depend on fixed patterns. We call it divine and untrammeled, Shen and Yi." And then there's Zhou Yigui. "Westerners are skilled in geometry, and consequently there is not the slightest mistake in their way of rendering light and shade and distance." Right? We know that the Jesuits excelled at geometry. And we know that a lot of the Chinese they encountered admired them for their skill of geometry. And we know that it resulted in these fabulous maps, for example, right? But when it comes to painting, Zhou Yigui tells us, it's sure they have the technique, but do we really like that? See, he goes on and says, yet the Europeans, they have no brush manner whatsoever. Meaning, they don't really have what it takes. They don't really have what makes a painting a painting. They don't really have what it takes to move you. Although they possess skill, they are simply artisans. And their work cannot be considered true art. And this is really interesting. So Zhou Yigui makes a distinction between what he calls the work of an artisan, craftsmanship, and art. And he says, depicting reality using these special, techniques, that's artisanry. That's, learning a skill, but it has nothing to do with art. Art is something different. Art is, something that takes you maybe to a different sphere, maybe to a different reality that allows you to express your innermost feelings. So, to summarize, there is really a perception that Western art is lacking certain sublime aesthetic qualities and is inferior to Chinese painting. Yeah? Now, what's interesting is, and this is kind of what we will focus on for the rest, of this lecture and, in your reading of the article, is that especially during the Qing, but already during the late Ming Dynasty, in the 17th and then 18th century, certain poets who lived in the south, on the southern periphery, came to change their minds, came to challenge, if you want, this conventional view of Chinese intellectuals regarding the distinction between Western and Chinese painting. So why in the southern peripheries? Well, see, this is a map of China, of Qing Dynasty China, right? Qing Dynasty China was actually much bigger than the Ming Dynasty, right? You might remember that the Ming Dynasty was kind of this, right? The Chinese heartland. And then when the Qing, the Qing overthrew the Ming, they essentially incorporated, what is Mongolia, what is all those territories along the Silk Road, what is now Xinjiang, those border territories. And they also reintegrated Tibet into China, right? The Qing, just a quick reminder, like the Mongols, was a foreign dynasty. So the rulers of the Qing were Manchu, and they came from what is now known as Manchuria, which during the Ming Dynasty was not part of China. It was really, it was a tribal society like the Mongols. And they fought, like the Mongols before them, they forged alliances with other tribes and together then invaded China, conquered it, and brought this whole territory under their control. Now, we know that the Jesuits had first arrived in the south, and we know that most foreign trade, especially with Europe, was conducted in the south, in Macau, later on Guangzhou. We know that Fuzhou, all of these places were trading cities, right, with the rest of the world. So that's the southern periphery of China. Just to recap, I think I've shown you these images before. The Portuguese, right, in the 16th century, 1535, they really start to trade with China. In the middle of the 16th century, they establish that permanent settlement in Macau, right here, opposite from Hong Kong. And nearby Guangzhou, or Canton, soon becomes the primary trading port for international trade of China. So here you have that map, right? I showed you that before. Here you have Macau, here you have Hong Kong, here you have Canton. This is the Pearl River Delta, right? Now, in 1750, the Kangxi Emperor of the Qing Dynasty actually granted licenses to a group of Canton merchants to conduct that trade with foreigners. And what's amazing is that those Canton merchants, those merchants in Guangzhou, became some of the richest merchants in the world. Actually, they were some of the richest people in the world at the time, just by wealth. But trade is always mutually beneficial, right? The Europeans, especially the British who engaged in this trade, and we'll talk more about that in a couple of weeks, also became phenomenally wealthy. Now, while tea, right, and silk were Canton's most lucrative exports, and as we will discuss soon, opium, its most infamous import, the local elites, the people there, both traders but also mandarins, developed a liking for European luxuries, such as clocks, mirrors, and art, including oil painting or behind glass painting. And soon, local artists began to merge these new Western techniques of painting, perspective, different kind of use of colors, light and dark, oil paintings, and Chinese techniques to produce a genre of painting that is usually referred to as trade paintings or export art. And that was both exported, but that was also, consumed by local elites, in the southern periphery. Now, interestingly, at the same time, we have, right about the time when these European paintings arrive in China, we also have more and more European painters come and visit China and paint there. And especially a little later, when sea travel became easier as the ships got bigger and it got cheaper and it became more convenient in the 18th and the 19th century, we have a bunch of British painters. John Webber, he was actually the official artist of Captain Cook, an important explorer, come to Macau. We have some other famous painters actually stay and work there. Maybe the most famous of them is an artist called George Chinnery. You can Google him if you like. There are lots and lots of his images of China on the internet. And he actually he befriended a Chinese painter who went by the name Tinqua. That was sort of his his nom de pluie, his sort of name with which he signed his paintings, and he taught him Western techniques, and Tinqua in return taught him Chinese techniques, right? So again, you have that beautiful fusion of Western and Eastern aesthetics. Now, I said that there was this growth of a local industry that essentially started to make art that fused the Western and the Eastern tradition, and that a lot of that was made for export, right? I said predominantly for export, but also consumed locally. And that this art then really becomes a very complex example of intercultural encounter, a hybrid, right? A hybrid of different aesthetics, taking, East and West, putting it together. Now, I had originally wanted to show you some of these examples at the Sutro Library at San Francisco State, right? I had told you we were going to make a little field trip to the Sutro Library to look at some of these trade paintings. But, well, that's going to be put off for a while. Won't be able to go. Hopefully during the semester I will be able to take you there. But I will show you some of those images nevertheless. Next class. We won't have time today. So now back to this term of ekphrastic poetry about paintings. So people in the South then, mostly intellectuals, mostly mandarins, mostly government officials, people who wrote poetry, people who knew how to write poetry. They wrote poems after seeing these Western paintings. And I put Western painting here into quotation marks because some of them were really Western paintings by, had come from Europe. But some of them were also these paintings that were made, for export in the South by Chinese artists, but that incorporated Western techniques, right? So in a way, a Western painting made in China. And these poets then who saw these paintings realized that, wow, these are very different. I've never seen anything like that. Because they were still unfamiliar with these European post-Renaissance techniques, right? We talked about perspective, use of oil paints, and they expressed, their anxiety, their distaste, their curiosity, their appreciation through poetry, okay? And you will read some of those poems for your assignment, okay? You will, here it is, here's the assignment, right? So you will read pages 9 to 16 of that chapter, Painted in Oil, Composed in Ink. And based on the chapter, I want you to reflect on the question, what can you say about Chinese opinions of Western art in the 17th and 18th century? What would you say are the biggest differences between Chinese and Western aesthetics? Okay? And please be sure to cite the chapter. So you have to obviously cite some of the poems that you read, but of course I also want you to read, the stuff in between, the scholarly stuff, okay? And then, right, obviously next, so the first part of the chapter kind of is a little bit, historical, theoretical, right? So starting on page 9. You don't have to read the very beginning. And then focus on at least one of the poems discussed on pages 3 to 16. Okay, there's 4 or 5. You have to at least talk about one. Cite at least a couple of lines and explain in what way the poet engages with Western aesthetics. Does he like the Western paintings he sees? What aspects does he like? Does he not like it? Why? And what does this tell us about changing views of the West in China? Okay? And finally, because this is now an online class, you have to engage with at least 2 of your peers. Write a comment or question. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree, maybe you would like clarification. I want this to be a dialogue, okay? So, due date, Tuesday, 6 p.m. And I shall see you again next week online for our next set of online lectures. Have a nice weekend and be safe.